Good morning, everybody. It's Wednesday, and welcome to Penn Vicarage. Lovely to see you. Hope you're well and cheerful, and thank you for joining us today. Don't know what you have planned for today. I was hoping for a game of golf this morning. It looks seriously wet and seriously blow out there, so we'll have to see about that. But there we go. It'll be a good day anyway, because God's with us, and that's good. So, to the Gospel of John, and we already are at the sharp end now. So, just to set the context, Jesus had his Last Supper. He has done some teaching to the disciples. Yesterday we had him in the Garden of Gethsemane, which is on the Mount of Olives. It's just over the other side of the Kidron Valley. He's been there, and he's been Judas and a cohort of legions of Roman soldiers have come along and they've arrested him and taken him away. And they take him first to the place of a guy called house called Annas. And here is what happens. John's Gospel, chapter 18, starting to read today at verse 12. So the soldiers, the officer, and the Jewish police arrested Jesus and bound him. First they took him to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who advised the Jews that it was better to have one person to die for the people. Simon Peter and the other disciple followed Jesus. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter was standing outside of the gate. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out, spoke to the woman who guarded the gate, and brought Peter in. The woman said to Peter, "Are you not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Now the slaves and the police had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing around it and warming themselves. Peter also was standing with them and warming himself. Then the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. Jesus answered, "I have spoken openly to the world. I've always taught in the synagogues and in the temple, where all the Jews come together. I've said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who heard what I said to them. They know what I said." When he'd said this, one of the police standing nearby struck Jesus on the face, saying, "How is it you answer the high priest?" It was like, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered, "If I've spoken wrongly, testify to the wrong. But if I've spoken rightly, why do you strike me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. They asked him, "Are you not also one of his disciples, are you?" "So you're not also one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the slaves of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, said, "Didn't I see you in the garden with him?" Again Peter denied it. And at that moment the cock crowed. Then they took Jesus from Caiaphas to Pilate's headquarters. It was early in the morning. They themselves did not enter the headquarters, so as to avoid ritual defilement and to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered, "If this man were not a criminal, we wouldn't have handed him over to you." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." The Jews replied, "We are not permitted to put anyone to death." This was to fulfill what Jesus had said when he indicated the kind of death he was to die. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So, there's essentially two bits of this morning's reading, really. There's the bit about Peter, and there's the bit about Jesus, the trial of Jesus. We'll start with the Peter thing. Firstly, it says Jesus and another disciple followed to the chief priest's house. Now, when it says another disciple, John is almost certainly talking here about himself. He talks a lot in his gospel about the disciple whom Jesus loved. So rather than using his own name, he tends to talk about that's what he calls about himself. So almost certainly here, this other disciple goes with Peter is John, and he's obviously got some connections amongst the high priest because Peter originally has to wait outside the courtyard. John being a sort of, because he obviously knows somebody on the inside, he's allowed in. But then he persuades them to let Peter in as well. And they're warming themselves because I'm told it will have been cold. Jerusalem's quite high, and it will have been quite cold at night. And they're standing by the fire. And then we have this incident where 3 times Peter is asked, "Do you you're a friend of his, aren't you?" And each time Peter denies even knowing Jesus. And you've got to remember, of course, that as we found out a couple of days ago at the Last Supper, when Jesus said, he's going to bit of what he's going to do. And Peter says, I'll follow you to the end. I'm good old Peter, in at both feet, he's going to be... The others can fall by, but I will never let you down, and so on and so on. Typical Peter. Peter at his absolute best, bless him. And Jesus says, before the cock crows, you will deny 3 times that you even know me. And Peter kind of says, no, never, I'd never do that. But of course, here we find that it actually happens. Now the question is, I suppose, kind of why? Because on one level, wouldn't it have been quite nice if, example of heroic Christianity, Peter followed Jesus all the way to the end and didn't deny him and went through the promises and so on and so on and so on. One level, it would have been quite a good hero story. This is how to follow Jesus, that kind of thing. So why did Peter deny Jesus 3 times? Well, we don't ultimately know, but I think it goes like this. Jesus had to be the saviour of the world. There had to be no question about that. Jesus is the saviour of the world. Jesus' death and what Jesus did is what saved us, not what anybody else did. And it's something, in the words of Isaiah 63, he had to tread the winepress alone. Where he is going, no one could follow, actually. When it comes to saving the world, there has to be something only Jesus could do, which meant that nobody, however heroic, including Peter, dare I say, could do it. Actually, only Jesus can save the world, which is, of course, is what he did, which is why Peter couldn't ultimately follow, or anyone couldn't really follow to the end, because actually it had to be Jesus and only Jesus who saves us. And it had to be, which I think is why Peter had, in a sense, always had to deny Jesus. He couldn't go to the end because only Jesus can save us. And I think actually, in a sense, that's something we often as a church need to remember today, actually. Because I think often we believe in our heads that Jesus is the saviour of the world. But often I think there's sometimes we try and do his work for him. I think often we see all the problems of the world and we wish that we could solve them too. And we often drive ourselves to distraction and drive ourselves to breaking point and so on and so on and so on, trying to save people. And that's great, on one level. We should do what we can to help people and so on and so on and so on. But I think this kind of reminds us that ultimately Jesus is the saviour of the world. Only he can save us. And sometimes we have to get to the point where we have to say, Jesus, over to you. I can do no more. I hand over to you. You are the saviour of the world. I hand this person to you, so to speak. And I think sometimes we have to remember, as Peter in a sense learnt the hard way, that Jesus is the saviour of the world. We often try and do his work for him, but ultimately Jesus is the saviour of the world. But the other thing I want to say is to do with the trial. Jesus then gets he gets taken to the high priest. I mean, ironic, the first place he goes to is not the high priest. He goes to the high priest's father-in-law. Annas is the first person he sees. And from there he goes to Caiaphas, who really is the high priest. And from there he gets taken to Pontius Pilate, who is the governor. But you may never have thought before, but there are some massive ironies here, because it makes you wonder who's kind of really in charge, The irony of the high priest thing is that the real high priest, who is Jesus, was being judged by the kind of temporary stand-in equivalent possible, which is Caiaphas, Annas, The real high priest, the one who is now sitting in heaven, sitting at the right hand of God, our great the great high priest, the high priest in heaven, allowed himself to be judged by Annas and Caiaphas, the kind of temporary stand-ins, if you know what I mean. And then, of course, he gets taken to Pontius Pilate, who is the Roman governor. And, of course, who's the real governor? Jesus is Lord of heaven and earth. Jesus is risen, exalted, glorified. He is King of kings. He is Lord of lords. So the real governor, if you like, allowed himself to be judged by the temporary stand-in equivalent, which is Pilate. And in a sense, often today, actually, we worry about what we think about God, but in some ways, what is more important, really, is what God thinks about us. We tend to think that the onus is on us, but actually, what's really kind of important is what God thinks about us. And I think I just try and get hold, if you can, of the irony here of all this judging going on here. That the real high priest allows himself to be judged by the stand-in temporary, And the real governor, you like, allows himself to be judged by the temporary standing equivalent, which is Pilate. But Jesus, being the real high priest and the real King of Kings, allows it to happen so that he can give his life for you and for me. And the great thing is that, we tend to focus on what we think about God, but the great thing is that God really loves you and that God really loves me. And Jesus, what he was doing here, just to prove it. So, a couple of things from this morning's reading. Firstly, hear about Peter, remembering that even Peter couldn't save the world. Only Jesus can do that. And we need to remind ourselves that Jesus actually is the Saviour of the world. And the other thing is, grab hold of the irony here of who's the real judge, who's judging who. And the real guy was being judged by the temporary stand-ins. Of course, that's all rather changed now, isn't it? God bless you. Have a lovely